Hi, everybody. Welcome to Smarter News. I'm Jenna, and I'm glad to see you today. We're going to tackle a really hot topic that is certainly trending online, but I'm getting a ton of questions about. And we're going to go about this topic a little bit different than I normally do on Smarter News. You know, we're all about quick, concise, and nonpartisan information. I want to clarify things for you so you can make up your own mind. I hope to do that with the situation that we're going to be addressing. But I also want to add a little bit of a personal twist to this as well. Because as many of you know, I've been a journalist for 20 years. I've worked in journalism in a whole bunch of different capacities. But one of the ways that I was a working journalist was as a national news anchor for Fox Business and Fox News. I left in 2017 because I really believe in nonpartisan news. And I believe there was another way for me to serve the public as a journalist. And that's the origin story of Smarter News in a very short period of time. There's a lot to that story, and perhaps we could talk about it more in the future. But that was the motivation behind it. I also had this very unique set of experience from the inside, you know, seeing media from the inside and wondering, are we actually providing the service that we should to the public? And it was that experience that helps form my own editorial decisions here on Smarter News. The big topic that is of conversation today is about Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel, as you know, is one of the most nationally recognized comedians. Up to you whether or not you think he's funny. Either way, he's nationally recognized. He is the host of a big late night talk show on ABC. It has been a tradition in America that these late night talk shows tackle culture and politics and have been institutions amongst the television networks. As of late, we're seeing some changes with that. But in general, this is why Jimmy Kimmel matters and why his platform has been significant. And just over the last 24 hours, we got news of an indefinite suspension. And there's been all sorts of questions as to why. A lot of questions about free expression in America, the relationship between the government and media, and a question about appropriateness. You know, what is appropriate as a broadcaster? What are the responsibilities of a broadcaster? So, what I would like to do today is something a little bit different than we normally do. I actually just want to share with you some of my experience as a broadcaster. For 7 years, I co hosted a national news show for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. I'm very familiar with how these networks interact with the government, how concerns arise about legal issues or potential worries about the FCC. So I want to bring you behind the scenes a little bit. I don't get to do that with every story, and as you know, I don't want to weigh in. I don't want to share my opinion, nor am I always clear about my opinion on a lot of our news stories. But this is where I think I can provide some really interesting insight because a significant portion of my career was in traditional broadcast news, and now media is completely different. We're going through this huge period of creative disruption. And I'm proud to say that Smarter News was really on the forefront of that. But in this particular way, I can provide some insight. And so, if you'll allow me, I like to share some of these personal stories. Before we get into this, though, I do want to point out a couple things. There are some holes in what we're going to be talking about, and the journalist in me cannot ignore these things. So, for example, we know that Disney, the owner of ABC and ABC, announced this indefinite suspension for Jimmy Kimmel on September 17th. That's a Wednesday. But we don't really know the reason why. Because of some interviews that happened after his show on Monday night, we believe we have some idea, but we don't have anything on the record as of this recording from Disney, ABC, Jimmy Kimmel, or his representatives. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge because everyone's tying it to this one event. By the way, I'm going to air it for you so you could hear it for yourself, but we don't really know. And, you know, I like to double and triple source things. So I just want you to be aware of that. And the reason why I think that is important is also from personal experience. There were moments that I saw people yanked from television because there was an instant legal concern with what they were doing and whether or not the network would be obligated in some way because of this person and what they had to say. There were other times where people would be yanked from the air because maybe they did say something controversial, but it was a sequence of events that took place where the network felt that's enough. We're going to need to take a pause. So until we hear more on the record about what transpired behind the scenes, there's a lot of different scenarios here. One of them I'm very curious about is whether or not Jimmy Kimmel was offered the opportunity to acknowledge, clarify what he was trying to broadcast on Monday, issue an apology, and move on. It is fascinating that in broadcast news, issuing an apology, acknowledging a correction actually can get you past that moment. Doesn't seem that in a lot of relationships, but in broadcast news, as you've likely seen, people do that all the time. Hey, I was wrong about this. It was inappropriate. I shouldn't have said it. I apologize. And we're going to move past it. It can be up to the public to decide if they want to accept that. But as far as your kind of, again, legal obligation or legal risk, that can be helpful. And at least I've seen it in that way. The other thing I want to mention here is what's very interesting about this story is we're really talking about broadcast television for the first time in a long time. As someone that worked on broadcast television for a decade, I can tell you I very rarely watch live TV, if ever. I just don't do it anymore. And a lot of what we're going to focus on today has to do with the rules about broadcast television specifically, and they really, really matter. But those same rules do not apply to podcasting or other forms of media right now. So it's a very unique media story that we're talking about, along with some of these questions about freedom of speech, which we also will tackle. And the last thing I want to mention to you, again, sort of behind the scenes look, is there's a rising question about government pressure. Did the Trump administration pressure media companies to make this move with Jimmy Kimmel in a variety of different ways? And what is that all about? And how do we feel about that? Because is the government putting their foot on the neck of free expression? We know in America, free expression protects us from government action. So my freedom of speech doesn't protect me from the repercussions of a private business. It doesn't protect me from the repercussions of a broken relationship because of what I said, but it does protect me from government arrest or government censorship as a private citizen. And if I worked for the government, I'd have even more protection from the government itself trying to limit what I say as a government employee, because that's one of the ways that the First Amendment is working in action. It's a government law, a government created law to protect you from government prosecution, but it doesn't protect you from the public or your friends or your personal accountability for what you have to say. So that's important to point out here as well. But the reality of the relationship between government and media companies is something that was very eye-opening for me behind the scenes as a news anchor. I was lucky. I was working on a show at the time that doesn't exist anymore on Fox News. It was a show that was straight news. So it was called Happening Now. And what it would do is we'd look at live feeds from all over the country and all over the world, and we would take from those live feeds about what was happening, like literally what was happening now. It was a great concept in a lot of ways. Sometimes there wasn't a lot happening. So you had to figure out what interviews you were going to do during that time. And I would do maybe 4 to 7 live interviews for a 2-hour period every single day. So it was really quickly moving news, and you talk to a lot of different people. And the relationship between those in the White House specifically and media organizations, regardless of administration, in my experience, was very strong. Meaning that if something happened on the air that an administration, Democrat or Republican, did not like, your boss could get a phone call. And you may or may not hear that message. It could depend. So, for example, let's say I had sort of a heated interview with somebody from the Pentagon, and they were kind of upset about it. Maybe they called my boss, and then my boss would call me and say, hey, that was kind of a tense conversation. I don't know if they're going to be super excited about coming back on, but hey, I think you did okay, so don't worry about it. Now, in that situation, I might go back and look at my interview and see, well, was I fair or was I not fair? How did I feel about that? And then decide if I would have changed anything or not. Occasionally, you would watch back things that you did on the air and think, I probably would have done that a little bit differently. I don't know if I love that. And so this constant conversation, this connection between the government and the networks was happening constantly, because a lot of the times people that worked in television would then go work for the government. And then the people in the government would then go work on TV. And this is how you see contributors in CNN or ABC who were former spokespeople for a certain administration, and now they're working on television. And oh, wait, they're going back to the White House to work again. This is not specific to political party. This is a revolving door between media and government that's happening constantly. So while it's a fair question to ask whether or not that's a healthy relationship, I also want you to know that it's something that is ongoing in my experience. And so the communication between television networks, bosses, and who is sitting in Washington, D.C. was happening at a fairly regular cadence. Now, the situation that I described to you about getting a call about an interview, for me, I feel like I was really lucky in a lot of ways. I was very straightforward on the news. One of the reasons I left traditional media is I knew it was getting more partisan, and that's not what I do. So I knew there wasn't a lot of ways to grow there, and I knew I needed to do that still in my career. But I didn't really get into those situations a lot. Like, I asked fair questions. Sometimes the interviews could be a little tense. Sometimes they weren't tense at all. Either way, you had to look at the end of the day and wonder, are you proud of your work, and did you actually serve the public, which is what we're all there for ultimately. And so I just wanted to give you that a little bit of background, because when we're talking about the role of the government or free speech or editorial guidance, there's a lot that is happening, a lot of voices that are happening, that are talking behind the scenes for any content that you're seeing on broadcast news, and specifically when something's live. So I broadcast live. So it could be very possible that I can make a mistake. Things happen on live television that are surprising. You can make easy mistakes, mispronounce words that you know very, very well, but for some reason you can't read them in a prompter. And you do things that you don't, that are sort of unexpected. That medium is very unique. It's what I'm doing right now to you, by the way. I'm doing live to tape this podcast. And so there may be a moment where I'm like, oof, wait a minute. I don't think that's exactly how I want it to sound. But usually I let it flow because I think it's the best product for you. But if I see a correction, it's really a nice luxury to go back and fix it. A lot of times you don't have that in broadcast. And I mentioned that because Jimmy Kimmel is taping his show, is my understanding, live to tape. So, or sometimes live, depending on the show. And so this matters too in this medium where sometimes things can be misinterpreted. And there's actually a question about that today. So let me take you to Monday night. Just to catch us up on where we are in the story of the murder of Charlie Kirk, at this point, we have a suspect that's under arrest. There were a lot of rumors flying online about who this person was and who he was affiliated with. What was his political leanings? What do we need to know about this individual? And we know that on Monday night, he's going to appear in court on Tuesday, and we're going to continue to hear a little bit more about this individual. So this is Jimmy Kimmel's opening monologue on Monday night.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them, and doing everything they can to score political points from it. In between the finger pointing, there was grieving. On Friday, the White House flew the flags at half-staff, which got some criticism. But on a human level, you can see how hard the president is taking this.
My condolences on the loss of your friend Charlie Kirk. May I ask, sir, personally, how are you holding up over the last day and a half, sir?
I think very good. And by the way, right there, you see all the trucks? They've just started construction of the new ballroom for the White House, which is something they've been trying to get, as you know, for about 150 years. And it's going to be a beauty.
Yes. Okay. He's at the fourth stage of grief, construction. There's demolition, construction. This is not how an adult grieves the murder of someone he called a friend. This is how a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish, okay? And it didn't just happen once.
When I heard it, I was in the midst of, building a great, for 150 years, they've wanted a ballroom at the White House, right? They don't have a ballroom. They have to use tents on the lawn for President Xi when he comes over. If it rains, it's a wipeout. And so I was with the architects that would design. It's going to be incredible. And they came in, they said, Charlie Kirk is dead. I didn't know what they meant. I said, he was dead. Charlie Kirk was shot. And they thought he was dead because it was so horrific, And I said, dead.
And then we installed the most beautiful chandelier. Sconces you wouldn't believe. There's something wrong with them. There really is. I mean, who thinks like that? And why are we building a $200 million ballroom in the White? Is it possible that he's doing it intentionally so we could be bad about that instead of the Epstein list? By the time he's out of office.
Okay. I played a little longer clip for you because I wanted you to see a little bit more than the 30 seconds or 45 seconds you might see online. The most important part of that clip happens right at the beginning. So I'm going to replay that for you in this moment.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything.
Okay, let me just stop you there. What did you hear there? How did you interpret this clip? Listen to it again.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it. In between the fingers.
Okay, so the reason why I want to play that for you is the way that I heard that was that he was saying that the MAGA gang was trying to characterize this kid as anything other than one of them, meaning that the suspect actually was one of them. That's how I interpret when I've heard this, and I've heard this, dozens of times now. I thought Jimmy Kimmel was saying that the MAGA group was trying to say that this person was not one of them because he was one of them. That's how I heard it. But it's interesting. Thank you to Christina, who is one of our Instagram followers. She's like, no, that's not what he was saying. I'm going to read you the sentence. The MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them. So she's saying, no, he was saying it wasn't a MAGA person. But you see, we heard it very differently. And apparently, we're not the only ones that heard it in a way that seemed to suggest that the suspect was actually aligned with MAGA. And MAGA was trying to distance themselves because he was one of them. Interesting, right? That you could actually hear different things from the same sentence, which maybe Jimmy Kimmel thought was being very clear, but apparently it was not. So Benny Johnson is a conservative podcaster, and he had the FCC chairman on his show. At the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is a very interesting organization because unless you work in broadcast news or you get a specific media story, we're not really talking that much about the FCC. But the FCC for me as a broadcaster would come up because you would think that you could get in trouble from the FCC if someone did something crazy on television, that the network could get fined, that the network could get sued, that you could get in trouble somehow with the government if something just unexpected happened on your show, or someone said an obscenity, or somebody exposed a body part that they weren't supposed to expose. I mean, think about Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson during the Super Bowl. For some of you, that won't ring a bell. Look it up. But it's an example of where you would think of like the FCC stepping in. And although I worked on a cable network, which has a little bit more flexibility than a network, like a broadcast network like ABC, there was always that concern that you could get in trouble in some way, not for your point of view. There was never a concern in the newsroom about editorially having a certain point of view or having a guest on with a certain opinion. It was if some of the content crossed the line into something that was inappropriate. And the way that I described this on social media was, you think I would relate working in broadcast news and thinking about the FCC sort of like driving down a highway and having the highway patrol. Like the highway patrol is not really monitoring how exactly I'm driving per se, what music I'm choosing, how loud I'm playing it. They're not really interested in. What they're interested in is that I'm staying in my lane and then I'm not speeding. I'm not breaking a very obvious restriction that's on the road. So I have some freedom as a driver, but if I get out of line, I could be pulled over. The FCC is very similar to that in my mind, as my experience as a broadcaster. Like, okay, they slipped on a word. It sounded a little bit, like an obscenity. Like, are we going to get in trouble for that? Now, as a person that's on cable news, I probably didn't have to worry about it as much, but with the newsroom, that's sort of the feeling. So the FCC chair is on with Benny Johnson. Benny Johnson knew Charlie Kirk and is upset about they're bringing up this clip by Jimmy Kimmel that's now been online for 24 hours. And the FCC chair is talking about the responsibility of the FCC. And I want you to hear that.
There's a very concerted effort to try to lie to the American people about the nature, as you indicate, of one of the most significant, newsworthy public interest acts that we've seen in a long time.
So he read or heard the Jimmy Kimmel comment the way others did, that Jimmy Kimmel was insinuating that this person was actually MAGA, when at this point, we learned from prosecutors and from investigators that that's not the case.
And what appears to be an action by Jimmy Kimmel to play into that narrative that this was somehow a MAGA or Republican motivated person. If that's what happened here with his conduct, that is really, really sick. And I've been very clear from the moment that I have become chairman of the FCC. I want to reinvigorate the public interest. And what people don't understand is that the broadcasters, and you've gotten this right, are entirely different than people that use other forms of communication. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
So that was viewed as a threat, that the FCC is coming for people that aren't going to regulate more of this content on the air. Whether or not he meant it as a threat or what exactly were the specifics of, there was actually a follow-up question on that. What do you mean by that? Before I get to it, let me show you this, though, so you could get a look at the FCC and what the FCC can or cannot do. So the FCC has limited legal authority. I'm reading right from fcc.gov. Limited legal authority to act on complaints relating to the content of television or radio programming. What is the FCC's responsibility? The limitations in the FCC's power to restrict or ban speech begin with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which decrees that the federal government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And it goes on. Nevertheless, what power the FCC has to regulate content varies by electronic platform. Over-the-air broadcasts by local TV and radio stations are subject to certain speech restraints, but speech transmitted by cable or satellite TV systems generally is not. The FCC does not regulate online content. The FCC does impose certain restraints and obligations on broadcasters. Speech regulations are confined to specific topics, which usually have been identified by Congress through legislation or adopted by the FCC through full notice and comment rulemaking or proceedings. And these include indecency, obscenity, sponsorship, identification, conduct of on-air contests, hoaxes, commercial content in children's TV programming. You may not know that on children's programming on network television, there's a limitation of what sort of ads can run. Broadcast news distortion. This is important. Accessibility to emergency information on television. So this is some of the guardrails that the FCC can look at. So while they may not look at the sentence in which the obscenity was used or what the point of view was of the person using the obscenity, the fact that there was a swear word on television could lead to a FCC complaint or fine. You see how that works? So there are some guardrails for these national broadcasters, and news distortion is one of them. And this is where apparently the FCC chair feels like this comment from Jimmy Kimmel falls within, because although these are still allegations against the suspect and the suspect is innocent until proven guilty, there's no information coming from law enforcement or those in authorities that this person was affiliated with a supporter of President Trump. And so this is falling underneath this umbrella, according to the FCC chair. But listen to how he talks about it. This is very important to how he's phrasing this.
You can't be running a narrow partisan circus and still meeting your public interest obligations. It means you can't be engaging in a pattern of news distortion. We have a rule on the book that interprets a public interest standard that says news distortion is something that is prohibited. Likewise, we have a rule that addresses broadcast hoaxes. And so, again, over the years, the FCC has stepped back from enforcing it, and I don't think it's been to the benefit of anybody. Just look at the credibility of these legacy media. It's absolutely through the floor. They used to be able to say at least they were more trustworthy than Congress, but now they're even less trustworthy than Congress. And so I think as a business matter for them, something has to change. And at the FCC, we need to reinvigorate this. So again, there's actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters. And frankly, I think that it's really sort of past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on Comcast and Disney and say, listen, we are going to preempt. We are not going to run Kimmel anymore until you straighten this out, because we licensed broadcaster, are running the possibility of fines or license revocation from the FCC if we continue to run content that ends up being a pattern of news distortion. So I think, again, Disney needs to see some change here, but the individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say, this, garbage, to the extent that that's what comes down the pipe in the future, isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities.
Okay, that's really important. And this is happening on Wednesday before this announcement is made regarding Jimmy Kimmel. I'm going to go back to the FCC document to talk about what exactly he's referring to and how this is important. Now, we mentioned news distortion, but here's another part of the FCC. The FCC has long held that the public interest is best served when he's talking about the public interest, okay? Has long held that the public interest is best served by permitting free expression of views rather than suppressed speech. Communications law and policy seeks to encourage responsive counter speech from others. Following this principle ensures that the most diverse and opposing opinions will be expressed, even though some views or expressions may be highly offensive. Let me go down here, though. What are the broadcasters' responsibilities? Individual radio and television licensees are responsible for selecting all broadcast content that their stations air. This includes both entertainment programming and news informational programming, whether the broadcaster actually creates the content or acquires it from third-party program producers. Broadcasters also decide how their programs, including call-in shows, will be conducted and whether or not to edit or reschedule programs or materials, yada, yada, yada. So the reason why this is important is you need to really understand the structure of the way that television and broadcasters work. ABC has some stations that are owned and operated by ABC, but there's a broad swath in the country where the ABC station in your area is owned by another huge media group. For example, Sinclair Broadcasting. And what the FCC chair is saying is, listen, these groups are responsible, these large media groups are responsible for what airs on their channel. And because of that, they should think about this programming coming from Jimmy Kimmel, because potentially this could be seen as news distortion that's not in the public interest. And this could really be a problem that the FCC would have to look at. Do you see how he kind of connected the dots there? After this took place, you had some large media groups that have quite a few different stations, apparently, according to reports, pressure ABC or Disney to do something about Kimmel. And there's a variety of different reporting about that he would need to issue an apology or he'd have to do 1, 2, or 3 things to get back on the air. But here's the important thing to know. Benny Johnson, who's doing this interview, who's this popular podcaster, political commentator, explained what happened behind the scenes after that interview. And this is something I think people are missing. So take a listen to this.
Jimmy Kimmel is lying to his audience. He has a duty, a legal duty. ABC has a legal duty based on their broadcast licensure with the federal government that is lavished upon them by the taxpayer to not lie to their audience, also to broadcast in the public interest. So by doing this, especially on national issues, by doing this, they are in violation of their broadcast license. My program said we are going to speak with Brendan Carr about this. We're going to actually use soft power and see what does the FCC think about this. Brendan Carr went scorched earth this morning on my podcast, saying that this was truly sick and that Disney and ABC News will suffer consequences for this, because this is a malicious lie told about a good and honorable man, the single worst left-wing political assassination in our lifetimes. Now, what happened next? My program and my producers continued to hit the bricks and call local stations, call the local affiliates, and ask if they are going to be broadcasting Jimmy Kimmel.
This is really important. This is a really key part of the story. So what he's saying is his team was like, okay, Brendan Carr said that FCC chair, let's just start calling everybody. And mentioned that the FCC chair just said on our show that they could be liable for what Jimmy Kimmel said. And imagine all these stations getting inquiries from a podcaster with a really big platform raising that question that maybe no one even noticed or thought about. Let's continue.
given the FCC's commentary and given the liabilities that Disney has put on them. And a huge compliment to Nexstar and a massive compliment to Sinclair Broadcasting, who both told us in statements that are now public that they are going to end the Jimmy Kimmel show. They're going to rip the Jimmy Kimmel show off the air. That took Jimmy Kimmel out of 37 million households. I didn't make that decision. Brendan Carr didn't make that decision. It was the affiliate stations. These are the organizations that own the actual broadcast stations. They manage them. ABC News simply creates the content. And so this is absolutely the free market. This is the local stations declaring that they will not try to defend the indefensible, and they said so in their statements. So this is absolutely and 100% justifiable. Sorry for the long answer, but it is important for everybody to understand this is not an attack on free speech. This is not because somebody told a naughty joke that we don't like. This is because Jimmy Kimmel did the indefensible, and he victim blamed Charlie Kirk's political assassination on himself.
Okay. So you may have a difference of opinion on that. Benny Johnson has a very specific point of view on it, and you're hearing it, and you're getting the idea of what was this like to be asked a question on this particular issue if you're an owner of a television station. And so remember, ABC is producing this show. On ABC local news programs, the show is going out. But then these other channels are owned by these other media companies, and they're being fed the ABC content, because that's why you go to, if you're watching ABC in Nashville and then you're watching it in Austin, you more or less are getting the same programming, more or less. I mean, there could be a little bit of difference here or there, but that's why there's consistency. You don't really know who owns those stations per se, but you're getting basically the same thing on ABC or NBC that you would see in another city. So this is what's happening behind the scenes. And then we have the revelation that Jimmy Kimmel has been indefinitely suspended. So there's another side story to this that I'm not going to get into a lot today, that some of these companies, these big media groups, are trying to do deals that would also need the approval of the FCC. So when they hear that the FCC is worried about the content that they're allowing to air on their own channels, did that change their decision, not because of the content of Jimmy Kimmel, but because of concerns about future business interests? And I just want you to know that that's out there. And whether or not we get more of a statement or get more interviews with these executives to see how much that played in, I'm just going to let you know that that's being talked about. And fair question to ask, what was really the motivation by these different media groups to say, this is enough? And that we kind of arrived where we started, which is, was this just crossing the line one more time, where these television groups felt that Jimmy Kimmel's programming was offensive to their audience, at least as like a minor concern, offensive and not interesting to their audience? Or were they concerned that this was actually a legal issue, that they would be called on the carpet by the FCC, and they don't want to risk it? Because in their minds, and listen, the legal teams are big here, folks. It's not, the legal teams are watching, they're understanding. And that's, I really am curious about that, about how much really legal risk did some of these groups think that they were potentially confronting if they didn't take a big enough stand about this particular issue. Now, I want to share one more soundbite with you, because there is a question about free expression. Wait a minute. For those of you who heard what Jimmy Kimmel said and said, listen, I don't really think that, I actually think he was saying something different. I didn't really take it that way. This feels a little bit nitpicky, and these are just a couple sentences. By the way, when Benny Johnson says removing from 37 million homes or whatever he said, just know that the data for broadcasting is fraught at best. So, for example, when I was on the air, I could say, well, I was in more than 100 million homes. I mean, that means that more than 100 million homes maybe had access to see me. But, maybe like 1.5 million people watched every day. Those are so it's just about access, access to these televisions, and a question about how good that data actually is. But the question too about how much does the FCC really want to be involved about weighing in on public interest or news distortion? Like, what does that really look like? And does news distortion really apply to nighttime comedians? Like, how far do you want to pull this along, FCC? Like what? And this is where there is concern about free speech. And so the FCC chair was actually on CNBC today. CNBC is a business network, and you're going to hear the stock market. They're on the stock floor of the stock exchange. So you hear some sound in the background. I just want to explain that. But I want you to hear what he had to say when he was asked some pretty direct questions about how involved you want to be with editorial content. So take a listen to this.
In the midst of a massive shift, we're in the midst of a massive shift in dynamics in the media ecosystem for lots of reasons. Again, including the permission structure that President Trump's election has provided. And I would simply say we're not done yet with seeing the consequences of that shift.
Well, what does that mean when you say you're not done yet, then? I mean, will you only be pleased when none of these comedians have a show on broadcast television?
No, again, it's not about any particular show or any particular person. It's just we're in the midst of a very disruptive moment right now. And I just frankly expect that we're going to continue to see changes in the media ecosystem.
Well, Chair Carr, I'm not sure I want to do this or not, but should the government have someone who reviews the writers before the host says something?
No.
How would you be sure that the host is saying something that you would think is okay?
That's not up to me. The way this works is that the local broadcast station is supposed to be responsible for the content. So the check on that content is not the government. It's not me here at the FCC. It's your local TV station in Provo, Utah. It's your local TV station in Scranton. It's on them under the law. They're responsible for the content. They're responsible for judging whether they think it's in the public interest or serves the needs of their local communities. Not for me to decide, but I'm very pleased that they feel empowered to stand up to Disney and Comcast in the appropriate cases.
What do you think about that? So he's saying, think about it. I'm thinking about it as a parent. If I said to my child who was asking to do something that was a little bit out of bounds, I mean, you could do that if you wanted, but there may be consequences to your actions. How much does that start affecting the decisions that are being made behind closed doors, editorial decisions about jokes or about performances or about what is allowed and what's not allowed and what you're going to bleep out? You know, think about some of the award shows when people bleep out certain obscenities. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because of the FCC. Why is it every time that we broadcast, and this would happen? So Fox News as a cable channel did not have the same broadcast license as Fox Broadcast, which is what you would see on your kind of your same sort of channels as ABC, NBC, CBS, your local channels. But there were times when Fox News as a cable channel would be fed to the broadcast channel, that what we would call Big Fox, because it was a bigger broadcast network, because there was breaking news. Something was happening. And so we were able to be broadcast on what was the broadcast network versus the cable network. When we would go broadcast, we would go on a 3-second delay. Why did we do that? We did that because if someone said a swear word, or let's say there was a car chase, this is actually a great example. Let's say there was a car chase and I was live on television and we decide that there's going to be some stations that are going to take from our cable network and they're going to run it live because it's such intriguing television. We would go on a 3-second delay. Part of the reason we would do that is occasionally you could see someone get hurt. There could be a shooting taking place. There could be a really violent arrest. There were moments that there was a concern about that, and we were not allowed to broadcast that. We could be in violation of what would be legally acceptable. So we would look live, but we would be on a 3-second delay. And that's part of the way the FCC works. It's pretty interesting. So the question is this posture by the FCC limiting free expression? Or is this like the highway patrol that's just presenting guardrails where more free expression can happen with a little bit more discipline? Now, that's a very fraught statement I just made. I admit it. It's a tough conversation. And one of the reasons that it is tough talking about freedom of speech, and we're talking about this related to the murder of Charlie Kirk, because he was exercising free expression, free debate, something that we hold very dear in America, but we have a lot of misperceptions about because we're not allowed to say everything we want to say all the time. That's not actually what's guaranteed by free speech. We're allowed to say whatever we want in most cases and not be prosecuted by the government, not be jailed or dragged away. That doesn't mean that we don't face the consequences of a private employer or personal relationships that we can see torn apart by what people post online. So we can't always use that excuse of free expression as saying, you need to respect what I say because I have free speech. That doesn't actually work that way in the real world. We know that. So this is a different posture that we see from the FCC chair, a position that we don't often see get into the public spotlight very often, unless there's a very specific event that takes place. And this is one of those. So what happens from here on out? How are networks approaching the content they're putting out? How are they thinking differently? And are those editorial choices inspiring more full debate where both sides are represented in some way, whether that's through a fictional show or through a comedy? Or is that closing off free speech and expression and free discourse, which the FCC said that they wanted to? Let me go back to what they said. They said the public interest is best served by permitting free expression of views, and want to encourage that the law and policy seeks to encourage responsive counter speech, even though some views or expressions may be highly offensive. So is this environment we're in creating a better environment where there's more robust debate about what's happening in the country, or is it shutting it down? And that's a question that I can't really answer for you today. So a lot to look at here, a lot to unpack, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. And I hope this was a little bit helpful to you as you continue to watch this story, because as Americans, despite maybe not talking about the Constitution every day, we do hold free expression, a free press very dear to who we are as a national identity, how we identify as citizens. And so these questions that come up are really important, but sometimes they're not quite as black and white. And in this particular case, what I see in this story is really a media story and a business story that has a little bit of a twist of free expression, but from a business perspective and a broadcast perspective, may have to do with content, timing, and tone, rather than trying to eliminate someone from saying something that's critical of the president of the United States. That's the way I lean from my experience, but you may have a different opinion. So I hope we put down the sequence of events very solid for you, and that you can think about, okay, sometimes these things happen in the news, even from non-traditional sources that have a cause and effect. It looks like, from what we're seeing, that the conversation with the FCC chair did have that. The question was, how close were these different media groups to actually action before this even took place? And what was happening behind closed doors? So a lot of questions yet to answer. I don't have all the answers, but I hope you enjoyed hearing some of the questions as we break down what's really a fascinating story in American media today. So I look forward to your questions and comments. I read all of them on YouTube, on X, on social media. You can DM me. You can always email me, hello@smarternews.com. And if you'd like to have more of these conversations, I look forward to having them with you. So thank you for this little bit of a reporter's notebook and / report on a major media story. And I look forward to serving you more with quick, concise, nonpartisan news on smarternews.com. Have a great night, guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.